The best way to learn about Lincoln-Douglas debate is to watch LD debate rounds or excerpts of those rounds, and then to ask yourself whether you understand what is going on, and if so, then to ask yourself what you would do if you were placed in a similar argumentation setting, what sorts of arguments you would make in response to the affirmative and or the negative, and at the end of the round, who you thought did the best job debating. In the spirit of that, and in the spirit in particular of helping students learn the art of speech writing, I'm going in this video to read and then critique an affirmative constructive speech that I have prepared on an LD resolution that might be used during the 2015 to 2016 school season. The topic is Resolved: Immigration Ought to be Recognized as a Human Right. So I will read my speech for 6 minutes and then spend a few minutes unpacking my speech, talking about the structure and logical flow of my speech, and then discussing what I take to be the main strengths and weaknesses of my approach. I'm going to be looking down a lot in this video simply because I'm reading my speech, which the screen cannot see, and my speech is here, at least the first page of it. So again, this is my affirmative constructive speech on the topic, Immigration Ought to be Recognized as a Human Right. Because opportunities should not depend on one's birthplace, I affirm that immigration ought to be recognized as a human right. Immigration means entrance into a country of which one is not a native to secure permanent residence or citizenship there, and ought implies moral obligation. James Nichol defines human rights as high priority norms that help protect all people from political, legal, and social abuses. Human rights are not absolute, but require that relevant parties respect rights when reasonably possible, and give claims arising from rights due consideration when rights conflict. This is why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights notes that concerns like public safety may permit limitations on rights. So a right to immigration means not that a country must admit all who seek entrance, but rather that a country admits those it can accommodate and acknowledges the rights claims of those it excludes, such as by reducing the odds of future exclusion or improving aspiring immigrants' lives with development aid. Human rights derive their significance from the freedoms they protect, and a freedom generates a human rights claim if it is sufficiently important and socially malleable. Richard Morgan explains Amartya Sen's framework. Quote, "The mechanism by which a freedom offered as a subject of a human right must be assessed consists of two threshold conditions. First, there must be a limit as to the level of concern necessary to qualify an opportunity as important enough to warrant the activities invoked to promote rights. The second is social influenceability. Society has to be able to do something to promote the freedom." These two conditions provide an intuitive and workable way of distinguishing freedoms that generate human rights from freedoms that do not. Amartya Sen explains, quote, "Some importance should be attached to, say, a person's freedom not to be assaulted, her freedom not to be called up by neighbors she detests, and her freedom to achieve tranquility. However, though all may be important, the freedom not to be assaulted is a good subject matter for a human right, but the freedom not to be called up by detested neighbors is not in general important enough to qualify as a human right, and the freedom to achieve tranquility, while important for the person, is too inward-looking and too hard to be influenced by others to be a good subject matter for human rights." The value is morality, since the word ought highlights the moral aspects of immigration's status in human rights discourse. Morality gives rules for distinguishing right from wrong action, and all such rules privilege rights, since societies derive their legitimacy from their respect for rights, and people frame affronts to their dignity as rights violations, so the criterion is protecting the rights of individuals. My sole contention is that the main freedom underlying immigration grounds a rights claim, which makes immigration a human right. Subpoint A. The main freedom underlying immigration, the freedom to obtain permanent residence or citizenship elsewhere, is sufficiently important since it involves vital life concerns. As Joseph Cairns notes, people immigrate because the benefits of moving are significant enough to justify the painful departure from one's native community. Quote, one might want a job, one might want to fall in love with someone from another country, one might belong to a religion that has few adherents in one's native state and many in another. One might wish to pursue cultural opportunities that are only available in another land. Beyond improving immigrants' lives, immigration is democratically important since it enables equal opportunity. Joseph Cairns explains, quote, access to social positions should be determined by an individual's talents and effort, not by birth-related characteristics such as race or gender, since there are no natural hierarchies of birth that entitle people to advantageous positions. But you have to be able to move to where the opportunities are to take advantage of them. So freedom of movement is essential for equality of opportunity. Subpoint B. The freedom to establish permanent residence or citizenship elsewhere is socially influenceable. The ability to immigrate depends on government policies. Becoming an immigrant in the US, for instance, requires that one obtain an immigrant visa according to State Department protocols. Most immigrants follow the protocols. In 2013, 72% of the 41 million first-generation immigrants in the US were here legally, which proves that freedom of international movement is tied to state decisions about how to process immigration applications. So, because the freedom to establish permanent residence or citizenship elsewhere is sufficiently important and socially influenceable, it grounds a human right to immigration which we ought to recognize. Thus, I affirm. That speech may have taken me slightly longer than 6 minutes to read, only because I wanted to slow down and emphasize more than I usually do so that people watching this video can understand me. In terms of the structure of my speech, the way I organized my framework arguments and substantive contention level arguments, my speech is a fairly typical one. I begin with an opening statement because one's opportunities should not depend on one's birthplace is the phrase I use, and then I state the resolution. I define key terms. I then move to a values framework where I propose a value or a value premise and a criterion or a value criterion, and then I state the tagline of my, in this case, sole contention, and then I move to subpoints A and B, each of which has multiple pieces of evidence to support the claim made by each of the subpoints. And then at the end of my speech, I have a summary statement which recaps the arguments I had made, and then the concluding phrase, a fairly generic one, thus I affirm. There are some important ways, I think, in which my speech deviates from the standard structure, and I'll talk in more detail about those deviations later on, but I want to say at the beginning that the reason I organized my speech in the way I did, and the reasons I made the arguments that I did, was that when I was researching the topic and thinking about how to best write an affirmative speech, I kept coming across very common negative arguments, and I wanted to construct an affirmative speech that would preempt what I thought to be the most obvious negative arguments. And according to my reading of the topic literature on immigration, specifically on the debate about recognizing immigration as a human right, one of the most common concerns with that argument is an economic concern. In other words, many people argue that if countries open their borders completely and let anyone come in who wants to come in, then that would depress the wages of people who were born in that country because, so the logic goes, immigrants are willing to work for longer hours at lower wages in order to get enough money to survive and to send back to their families back home in the form of remittances. So the potential economic harms of liberal immigration policies were forefront on my mind when I was thinking about how to craft my case. And what I decided to do was to define human rights in a way that would allow me to preempt those arguments or to render them irrelevant to my speech. In my case, I decided to define human rights as non-absolute, essentially as non-absolute moral entitlements, so that if the negative were to raise the economic concern, saying that excessive immigration depresses wages, which is bad for the citizens in the destination country, I could respond by saying, well, if immigration after a certain level would pose a severe economic threat to citizens in the destination country, then in those cases, countries are justified in restricting immigration flows for the sake of native workers. That would not constitute a violation of the right to immigration. It would simply mean that the country, though it recognizes in general a right to immigration, is willing to suspend that right or suspend certain privileges that flow from that right when economic circumstances or public safety matters require that they be suspended. So that was my big picture thinking when putting together this speech. And in terms of the strategic decisions I made about which terms to define and how to organize the top half of my speech, I think the influence of that line of thinking on my speech is fairly obvious. I spend a lot of time talking about what human rights are. I argue that human rights are not absolute, and I provide several reasons for that. I then provide a very specific conceptual story of how human rights emerge, that human rights are based on freedoms, and freedoms generate human rights when the freedoms deal with human rights that are sufficiently important and sufficiently socially influenceable. All of that was an effort on my part to frame the human rights debate in a way that would be favorable to me, but that also wouldn't be unduly unfair to the negative. So that was the top half of my speech. You'll also notice that if you've listened to other affirmative or negative constructive speeches, I didn't spend a lot of time at the framework level. That is, when I talked about what my value is, morality, and what my criterion is, protecting the rights of individuals, I spent really only a few sentences defining each term and explaining why I was using that particular term. And the reason I did that was, in my opinion, the essence of my case in terms of the upper half before I get to the contentions is really in terms of how I define human rights and how I link human rights to the freedoms that underlie human rights. And I thought that that was the important part of my speech. The actual framework paragraph where I state the value and the criterion I thought was not as strategically necessary for my speech. I wanted to include it mostly as a formality, but I didn't plan to refer to it extensively in my rebuttal speeches. And then one final way in which my speech might differ from other speeches is that my actual subpoints are fairly short. Debaters on the affirmative side may devote 4 minutes, 5 minutes, even more of their 6-minute speech to describing their contentions and their evidence for their contentions. I devote relatively little time to discussing the subpoints, and the reason I did that was that I felt that the arguments I was making at the subpoint level were intuitive enough and obvious enough that I didn't need to dwell excessively on them. In other words, I thought that no one would reasonably argue with the claim that immigration matters to the immigrants, that they have valid reasons in general for wanting to immigrate. No one would reasonably dispute the claim that freedom of movement is necessary for equality of opportunity, and so I thought no one would reasonably argue with the claim that freedom of movement depends on whether the destination and country allows freedom of movement. And I do beef up those claims with some pieces of evidence. Some might say some analytical warrants, which is just my reasoning, and some empirical warrants, which is when I cite evidence from other scholars who have written about the issue. But the main idea here is that I felt my arguments were strong enough by themselves that I did not need to devote more time to them than I thought was necessary. So that's a big picture overview of why I composed my speech in the way that I did. The main lesson to take away from it is that whenever you sit down to write a constructive speech, whether it's an affirmative one or a negative one, you should have a plan. You should know not just what you're going to argue, but how your speech will interact with the arguments that your opponent will likely make. How can you respond to the most obvious arguments on the other side? And how can you prepare for the most obvious responses to your speech? In my case, as I said, I knew what I was getting into in terms of negative arguments about economic concerns, which is why I decided to define human rights in the ways that I did and to spend as much time on human rights as I did in my speech. I think to recap what I've just said, that the strengths of my constructive speech are that I do spend a lot of time talking about human rights and explaining in fairly precise detail how human rights emerge from freedoms. And I think that when it comes to the contention level arguments, subpoint A and B, that intuition is on my side, which is a fairly good thing to have on your side when you are in a debate round. At the same time, my speech is not perfect, and there are, I think, several important weaknesses with it that an opponent can and should exploit. At the first half of the speech, when I talk about human rights, what human rights are, and how human rights emerge, it becomes very clear if you listen to what I say that my arguments about human rights are really just based on a series of vague assertions. I say that human rights are based on freedoms. That's the most important sentence in my speech because everything else I say about why freedoms produce human rights depends on that initial premise that human rights are based on freedoms. But I don't provide any evidence for that point. I don't explain why they have to be based on freedoms. And if the negative debater were to ask me, why are human rights based on freedoms? Why can they not be based on something else like dignity or integrity or justice? Then I would have a difficult time with the evidence I have in my speech responding to such a claim. Similarly, the Richard Morgan Amartya Sen evidence is similarly unwarranted and vague. Amartya Sen just argues, in the evidence that I read, that importance and social influenceability are the two threshold conditions for determining when a freedom produces a human right. But in the evidence that I cite, Amartya Sen doesn't explain why those are the best or the only conditions that we can use. He simply says that these are the conditions we can use, and they work when we apply them to fairly intuitive scenarios, but he doesn't justify his conditions any more than that, at least in the evidence that I cite. So if the negative were to ask me, why do we have to use those two threshold conditions? Why can't we use any others? Then, again, using the evidence in my speech, I would have a difficult time responding to that argument. Two other weaknesses with the threshold conditions are that, number one, they are fairly vague. I am susceptible to the negative argument that there is no bright line, that's the phrase that debaters often use, to my standards. When do we know exactly when we cross the threshold of importance? When do we know exactly when we cross the threshold of social influenceability? Those aren't questions that Amartya Sen answers, and those aren't questions that I would be able to precisely answer in cross-examination or rebuttal periods. And the second weakness and final weakness with the Amartya Sen threshold conditions arguments is that framing human rights as dependent on two conditions places me at a strategic disadvantage because in order to win the debate round by my logic, I have to win two arguments. I have to win that human rights are based on a freedom, that the human right to immigration, rather, is based on a freedom that is sufficiently important and sufficiently socially influenceable. If I lose even just one of those arguments by my own logic, I will have lost the round. So the negative debater can devote a lot of time, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 minutes, even more, to focusing just on one aspect of those conditions, maybe focusing just on importance or just on social influenceability. And I would be at a time disadvantage since I have a 4-minute first affirmative rebuttal speech and a 3-minute second affirmative rebuttal speech, whereas the negative debater has a 7-minute constructive speech and a 6-minute rebuttal speech. So framing those two conditions as jointly sufficient rather than as independently sufficient places me, I think, at a disadvantage compared to the negative. And then the final potential deficiency with my speech is that the evidence I use to support subpoints A and subpoint B makes sense, but I don't think it is great evidence. The evidence for subpoint A, specifically the first Joseph Karen's card, when he talks about the reasons people have for wanting to immigrate, is not empirical. He doesn't cite the results of surveys of why immigrants decide to immigrate. He simply asserts that these are the reasons why immigrants decide to immigrate. And then at the subpoint B level, I make arguments about why immigration is the freedom underlying it is socially influenceable, but I make those arguments exclusively with reference to the United States. First, I say that the State Department has a procedure for permitting or denying immigrants to come, and then I cite data about how most immigrants in the US are here legally. But if the negative debater were to offer counter evidence from other countries, again, I would not be able to respond to that counter evidence, only to reiterate the importance of my US-centric evidence. So that is a more thorough overview of my speech. As I said at the beginning, it follows a fairly standard structure with some deviations from the standard format. And I think that it does have strengths and weaknesses. And at the very least, for someone who's learning about how to write a speech, understanding why I think that the strengths are strengths and why I think that the weaknesses are weaknesses is an important part of getting to grips with the strategy of writing speeches and thinking about how to respond to opposing speeches when you are participating in a debate round. The task of writing speeches and responding to speeches is much more nuanced than I've painted here, but I hope that this video has been a helpful overview of one example of an affirmative speech and the various strengths and weaknesses of that speech.